Well, good day, everybody. Today's guest is investigative journalist and #1 bestselling author of Wilful Blindness. If you have not picked up Sam Cooper's book, then I strongly recommend that you do so. It is an amazing document that basically lays out what's been going on with political interference and cartels, money laundering in Canada. So, a very interesting read, and I think a topic and subject that so few people actually are even aware of, let alone fully understand. So, welcome our guest today. Welcome, Sam.
Really glad to join you today.
Yeah, well, I've been wanting to have you on for some time, so I was really glad when you agreed. Um, I have so much to ask you, and as I explained earlier, you have been doing so much work and have connected so many dots to so many different topics. You've been a hard man to follow.
Yeah, it's hard for me to keep up with the news breaking in the world these days, let alone Canada. And I try to cover it all as much as I can.
Awesome. Awesome. So I thought a good place to start, though, would be with your book, Willful Blindness, so that you can kind of just give people a rough idea as to how did you get into this, and then lay out your findings for willful blindness. And then, we can connect dots with, using Epstein. We can connect dots using your most recent with Senator Wu. And I really want to go into touch into a lot of that because I don't honestly believe that Canadians fully understand just how infiltrated and just the level of corruption that's going on within our own country. So I'm going to hand it over to you and let you explain some of that.
Sure. Well, my book, Willful Blindness, really started from my work as a young reporter in Vancouver. This is going back to pre 2010. As a young reporter in Vancouver, I was trying to understand Vancouver's real estate market, which made no sense from a economic or sort of a financial analyst perspective. They're very average to low median incomes for Canada in Vancouver, beautiful city, and the real estate wealth is incredible, and it became quickly apparent that a lot of it was offshore, and yet still people weren't reporting the incomes of how they were affording these homes. And so year after year I sort of unraveled what a professor who read my work at the Vancouver Sun later termed the Vancouver model of transnational money laundering. And it has a lot of different angles, but I think I became somewhat, famous for breaking, a typology of money laundering that's now recognized around the world. I say now the U.S. Treasury has massive $300 billion money laundering study into how Chinese organized crime through underground cash brokerages is laundering money across the Western Hemisphere for the Mexican cartels. And I'm the one that basically uncovered a version of that very model through British Columbia casinos that was coming through in massive quantities. So we could talk about the book a lot, but I think it became of interest to people in the United States and elsewhere in various governments because I explained how literally billions of dollars of drug cash were being laundered through BC government casinos almost in broad daylight. And in my book, I explain how that involved, ultra wealthy and politically connected people from China laundering drug cash through BC's government controlled economy.
All right, so that's a pretty big statement because we're talking now, we're implicating, politicians and very wealthy individuals, both Chinese. And we have an organization which you've pointed out as well called United Front, which acts a bit as a proxy to the, People's Republic of China or, the Communist Party. Um, let's draw some connections there because you did bring out, I know like right now a lot of people are focused on what's been going on with Epstein and a lot of these other things and all these high profile individuals, and there's a bit of racketeering going on, and but everything I find always follows the money. So let's dig in a little bit to these underground banks. I think is what you refer to them as in your book, and the underground banking and how they were laundering the money because organized crime only works because they have an ability and a means to take dirty money and get it back out into circulation so that they can use it.
Yeah. So the Vancouver model money laundering story was for me, and I think the readers, easier to grasp because it was revealed through my work in Vancouver that you had foreign nationals, mostly all from China or Hong Kong, flying into Vancouver and literally walking through the doors of government regulated casinos with duffel bags of cash, suitcases of cash.
And
And
nobody asked a question.
no one's asking a question. There's casino videos that, again, were produced through government inquiries that stemmed from my investigative reporting, where you would literally see an Asian person walking up to the casino cash cage. So you've got essentially a government regulated employee receiving literal stacks of cash, right? And this, people that know Canadian financial regulations know, even on the face of that, that cannot be legal because it's not, the cash is not presented in a way consistent with standard banking practices or financial due diligence. But what became, what my work proved was that Chinese organized crime slowly but surely has taken over as a broker of money laundering for international and domestic gangs across Canada and the world. Uh, Essentially, there are cash warehouses. Famously, one was discovered in my investigation, in a Richmond, British Columbia office tower. It had bulletproof glass windows. And so if someone was just walking down the hall of this Vancouver area office tower, it would look like a regular financial services company, almost like a dentist's office. But if they could walk into the back room where the business, the proceeds were accumulated, they'd see suitcases of cash and, drug dealers from Calgary, Edmonton, across Western Canada, Vancouver, of course, were driving in their drug proceeds. So again, suitcases of cash collected from drug sales and delivering them to this brokerage of international money laundering. And so that's simple enough to see. That the other side of it is you'd have ultra wealthy, what they call whales, casino whales, coming in from China, and they are essentially getting this drug cash brokerage, warehoused cash given to them where they can walk into the casino and they launder it. And there's many different, steps to laundering it. It moves across the world. It goes, it involves cash pools in Mexico, Peru, where the Latin cartels are working with sort of the Chinese diaspora money brokers. But on a simple term, that's the Vancouver model transaction. An ultra wealthy person from China who wants, here's a key, to escape China's capital controls, makes a deal with, a gangster that's connected to this cash warehouse in Vancouver to get, a loan. And they'll come in, take that drug cash loan, gamble, and they'll pay the gangster back. They'll pay his associate back in China. It works other ways. The ultra wealthy could be a Chinese politician, could be a Chinese police officer, will deposit cash with the Vancouver cash brokers, coordinate in China, and then receive a payout, of course, minus a little fee in Vancouver. And it's drug cash. At the end of the day, that's the key thing. It's drug cash. It's laundered through the casinos, and basically it gets exchanged, or the value gets sent back to China, where it's funding essentially more fentanyl production. The fentanyl gets sent to Vancouver and the process repeats. That's at a simple level Vancouver model money laundering.
Unbelievable, especially considering I go into the bank and I ask for $3,000 and it's 101 questions as to what you're going to use it for. And we have $10,000 limits for crossing the border. We have, AML, try making an investment, and without doing AML on somebody. And it's like, so it seems to be all these rules for us, but yet these elites and the criminal organizations and networks obviously have found a very easy way to get around that in Canada. So why Canada?
Well, that the way you framed it is absolutely the key question, and that takes me to the Toronto Dominion Bank fentanyl money laundering story. And my one of my sources, I think most of your viewers will know the TD Bank story, but they made the exact point that you did. In any other community, essentially in United States or Canada, one cannot walk around with a bag of $200,000 in cash. But as it turns out, especially in the Chinese diaspora in Canada, so Vancouver could be Calgary, Toronto, and Vancouver are very key, high proportion diaspora populations. It becomes, as my U.S. government sources said, normalized. Not just within the casino money laundering story, but in the Canadian big bank story, where a person from the Chinese community, we can say they're elite because they have a lot of money at their disposal, could walk into a TD Bank branch in the New York area and do that exact same transaction. So literally, videotape evidence will show the casino, okay, the bank teller in this case, receiving, massive bales of cash. And it's the same thing. In the US government's investigation, they found Chinese international students were used as what's called money mules, or sort of straw account holders that would work with these cash warehouse. So the same story, you've got a cash warehouse that has essentially bought Mexican cartel drug proceeds from the streets of New York in this version of the story. And they're using Chinese international students to walk it into the bank. And the US government says, well, Canada let this go. It's not just the diaspora community that was getting away with it. Canada's government basically let its big banks, not just BC government casinos, be used, in varieties of this Vancouver model money laundering.
And that's the disturbing part for me, because we have these supposedly highly regulated banks that apply rules to everyday individuals like you and I. We could never get away with this. And yet it's somehow happening right out in the open. And if you can find it, and you did, and you did an amazing job at reporting on this. We have CSIS, we have our own investigative, criminal, organized crime, police forces and dedicated resources here in Canada. Why hasn't anybody done anything about this?
You're right. CSIS has data on this. The RCMP has data on this. More to the point, FinTrack, our anti-money laundering intelligence watchdog, which reports, of course, up the chain to the Minister of Finance, had exquisite, as they say, visibility on this money laundering model going through the Canadian banks. An interesting anecdote is during the pandemic, when casinos, government casinos, were shut down. This method of money laundering, through TD Bank and all the other big Canadian banks, it evolved, through money mule Chinese students again, setting up fake accounts and running that drug cash into Canadian banks. And how do I say FinTrack knew? They put out a massive sort of typology warning in 2023. I've done a number of stories on it at the Bureau, demonstrating what essentially is the exact criminal case for TD in New York, except Canada's government, FinTrack, was mapping it, and there's no charges. Nothing is stopped. So your question is, why isn't Canada's government doing anything about it? I think that the title of my book, Wilful Blindness, that is turning a blind eye to a massively profitable source of liquidity for Canadian legal businesses that Canada's criminal and financial intelligence knew. There's no question. They knew that a lot of this money was drug money, and they didn't do anything. And that's why my high-level sources in the U.S. government say not only the Trump administration, the Biden administration before it was very upset with Canada. The Americans feel like it's a slap in the face. People have dying fentanyl overdoses across the country. Canada's government knows that TD and other banks were letting this go. And TD only got, I believe it was a $9 million administrative fine in Canada. they've got a 3 billion US dollar deferred prosecution agreement in the States. And that case could still keep going. So at the end of the day, I think it's a morality question, and it's a question of people. Let's remember, TD Bank's board, I mean, has, I think, Frank McKenna, who's a very close associate of, or friend or former US ambassador, very close to Mark Carney. So it's a question of whether Canadian elites can be accused of turning a blind eye. And, bluntly, I've come to the conclusion that they can be accused of that.
Yeah, well, I have real issues right now with accountability or the lack thereof of decisions that are being made on by behalf of our politicians on behalf of Canadians. I'm glad you brought up what you did there with respect to Mark Carney and the politics behind this, because we have, I have followed, I hate to use the words conspiracies. I'm more of a prophet these days because it seems like every conspiracy I've ever spoken to seems to be more truth than fiction. But the reality is, you do have these elites, of which case Mark Carney is definitely one of them. He is one of the higher, people like Justin Trudeau, and really to pick on him. But the reality is, Justin Trudeau wasn't a very intelligent man. He very much was the evident, the puppet, being controlled by somebody, in my opinion. Carney is one of the ones who's doing the controlling, I think. And so now you're seeing, all these names on the Epstein list. And I like the names on the Epstein list because it's bringing out a lot of the banking, and the
Mm-hmm.
financiers, and connecting a lot of the dots, or at least for me, I'm beginning to see a lot of the dots connected. And even in the Epstein files, suggesting with Lord Mendelsohn there,
Yeah.
and the Chinese infiltration and the connections, and how all of this is really coming back around, which is why, for me, again, I come back to why Canada? Why does China have such a significant interest in infiltrating our political system? It can't just be getting the capital out of China, which I know there is definitely some of that. But this goes
Yeah.
like the United Front, goes much
Yeah.
deeper than just getting capital out. Like they are doing truly manipulative, influential, activities to, infiltrate, the Canadian political system. So what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, remind me to come back to Lord Mandelson, because Mandelson and Epstein definitely bring in the case study that I've covered for the Bureau, where transnational global political and banking elites uh, do intersect with what I find to be international intelligence agencies. And it's not a question of whether Epstein was working for any one company or any one country or intelligence agency, but it's very clear that people like him at a global level are facilitating connections between sometimes criminal people in a certain country, sometimes elites like Lord Mandelson, and the Chinese networks that I have detailed in my book and can connect to Jean Chrétien, for example, uh, or some corporations in Eastern Canada do and have come up in the Lord Mandelson sort of network. So maybe I'll come back to that. But the United Front, I feel that I broke some ground in two ways in the book: the financial crime story of the Vancouver model, and being one of the first reporters in the West to sort of detail what China's United Front Work Department is and does. So, I mean, very recently I've reported on the Jamestown Foundation, which is a think tank in Washington where we have international, geopolitics and intelligence experts working for a former CIA, very high level China influence analyst. They came out with a report just in the past week that detailed 2,000, I believe, 2,300 known United Front Work Department community groups in Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. And the real kicker here, I wasn't surprised. I would have expected this, but a kicker for most people is Canada has 5 times the concentration of Beijing Chinese Communist Party linked community groups in, on our soil. And the report and its author come right out and say it. Canada is targeted, to answer your question, because China has an objective to replace the United States as the leader or the global hegemon. For us, it's the leader of the free world. So, freedom of religion, expression, freedom to not be chased around by thugs, from a foreign government. That's what we expect in Canada and the United States. Beijing is using these United Front community groups. They have taken over what were often, groups of immigrants from various different hometown areas of China. They've taken them over with their intelligence handlers in the United Front in China and in consulates in North America and Europe. And Canada, why are we saturated with these CCP cells, which is what they are? Essentially, that report that I'm citing says because Canada is seen as important for, China's strategy to target its actual objective, which is the United States. So my research has always, I think, found that Vancouver and Toronto especially are saturated with these international organized crime and CCP, financial networks. And now we know that the political cells of the CCP go hand in hand with these financial crime networks. And the Jamestown report even says this. It doesn't put the focus on it that my book does chapter after chapter, but it says that the CCP uses these United Front groups for human trafficking and money laundering and other criminal activities. So this is a high-level U.S. Think tank with intelligence analysts confirming, what I broke in my book, and a lot of people probably saw as a conspiracy theory for a long time, and that was Beijing using its political cells on our soil for criminal activities as well as political influence, transnational repression, which is the CCP police station story, and many other activities, political and criminal.
And see, that's, I think, what a lot of people don't understand is we did have Chinese police stations operating on Canadian soil. We have Chinese security who, through agreements, have the rights to secure Chinese-owned assets on Canadian soil. So, there just seems to be such a strong connection between Canada and China. And I'm glad you brought up the real objective here, I think, is to weaken the United States economy in
Mm-hmm.
particular, to kind of destroy, I think, that Western culture a little bit. I
Yeah.
mean, and you see this through the United Nations and the role that China plays there, and even China itself. I mean, throughout history. And I know you are a man of history, right? You have your degree in history. China has never hidden the fact that it has big ambitions, as far as control and power and influence around the world. You see that with their the road and belt
Yeah.
objective, right? They lend countries money knowing these countries will never be able to repay the money. So what they do, they take the asset. So this is one of the things I want to dig into a little bit, because Carney and the tariffs, Trump, everybody came down on Trump about tariffs. And, to a certain extent, your book is there, but this is not a very well-known story. Like, people don't understand that this is happening right underneath their nose. And everybody went elbows up, and in gets, Mark Carney, who has been talking about being tough on the United States. And now we have, we're cozying up with China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's so much to talk about there that I think I can pull a thread on what you said, that us cozying up to China. My work in the book and at the Bureau has pointed to the fact that from Pierre Trudeau to Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin Lessermore, of course, Justin Trudeau, now Mark Carney, uh, all of these, especially liberal prime ministers, not that some conservatives haven't been influenced, but the liberal prime ministers, including Carney now, we can see them as proteges or supported candidates of things like the Canada-China Business Council. Jacques Chrétien, after Pierre Trudeau, really solidified the bonds of with an entity that my book deals with a little bit called CITIC International,
Yeah.
which is a Chinese state sort of guided investment fund. It's so many offshore entities, but this one particular company has connections to units of the Chinese military, units of the Chinese state, and my work, among others. I've even seen Michael Kovrig talk about it recently. Says that Jean Chrétien and his relatives in the Power Corporation of Montreal have been in direct business dealings with CITIC. And so this is an entity that also came up in something called Chinagate, about $3 million in donations to the Clinton White House. And that happened, in the 1990s while the US government was investigating arms dealing coming from this very same Chinese entity illegally into California to go to street gangs. So I see CITIC and, Chinese state entities and their connections to the Clinton White House, their connections to Jean Chrétien, their connections to the Canada-China Business Council as part of China's global intelligence and influence operations, which are aimed at, securing leverage into Western elites like Jean Chrétien. And what do you know? Let's get back to the Epstein files and Lord Mandelson. I found that Epstein, a Chinese tycoon who his name is Desmond Shun, and Lord Peter Mandelson were sort of all involved in brokering of dealings with this CITIC International. So that my work is always about seeing sort of the patterns repeating. And so when I saw the Chrétien sort of group tight with CITIC, Lord Mandelson and Epstein and others tight with CITIC, making those international sort of banking relationships with political ties, and at the center of them, a Chinese intelligence entity. That's what I really think the Epstein story is about, in addition to whatever, horrific crimes against women and children, occurred there. So at the end of the day, I do think this is about China trying to overcome the leader of the free world and the protector of, religious speech and etc., which is the United States.
Yeah, the hard part for me that I get so concerned with is, especially with Mark Carney, is he has been using, the tariffs. He's been using the United States to and the actions of Trump to create a distance and to build a wedge between Canada and the United States, which is truly, I mean, and he talks about trade, which is so nonsensical. And this because we do what, maybe 6% of our trade with China, yet we do almost 80% with the United States. We have one of the best deals with the United States on tariffs, and Canada, which is another thing that people don't understand either, is that we have tariffs on goods that come in from the United States, milk and dairy. You want to talk
Yeah.
about cartels, right? You don't have to go far. Canada has them too. Bruce Party often, states in many of my interviews in our private conversations, he says, the Canadian government is a cartel. For all intensive purposes. It's not really serving the interests of the Canadian people. It truly is self-serving. In the way that it's been infiltrated with our institutions, whether it's healthcare, whether it's our education. But let's talk about Lord Mendelsohn a little bit more here, because in the Epstein files, I mean, Mark Carney is mentioned 69 times, all around finance, banking, right? He was the governor of England, the Bank of England, Bank of Canada here. And it was actually Harper who appointed him here for the Bank of Canada.
Mhm.
Both of Harper and I don't want to pick necessarily on just the Liberal government, because I think this has been going on a long time, and I really see whether it's conservative or whether it's Liberal, there's two sides of the same coin here going on. Our MPs that apparently have had political interference, they've never been disclosed, right? And that's because there's names on both sides of that blue and red, right? It's not just one or the other. And so with respect to, connecting some of these dots, I being in the money business, this is, in my opinion, is largely about money and control. And this is how they're doing it. This is how they're using it. And Canada, I think, could have played a very big role in preventing this and in stopping much of this, had they not allowed this type of activity and this type of money laundering to go on, because it does. It takes money to make these activities work. You can't do this if you don't have money to bribe people, to pay people, to move things across borders. So moving forward here in a lot of this, I mean, because I think there's going to be a lot more to come out. What are the areas that you see, because when I look at, your article that you wrote about the United Front, 2,294, they have truly like identity-based organizations, business associations, and then student organizations. Those were the top three big ones that they've infiltrated and where they target. So are we going to see
Yeah.
this continue, or are we going to see this, now that there's more light coming to it, are you going to see it change direction a little bit?
Well, I see the intention of the authors and the Jamestown Foundation in choosing. There are United Front groups in 130 countries around the world. So they could go on and on doing their network mapping, the similar work that I do. They chose Canada, United States, Britain, and Germany because these are important leading democracies which could work together in an ideal world to combat China's infiltration, which I believe, if you really get at it, it's not President Donald Trump's tariffs. In some cases, are not just about making America greater or richer. They are about fighting, China's use of international trade to secure influence or to move, I assert, drug money around the world with Chinese state networks, and how China uses international organized crime to run some of its operations and to secure influence. So you pointed to a few of these different entities, or rather categories of United Front groups. I was happy that the report focused on a group in Vancouver, a so-called cultural group. And this was a very same group that I had, rigorously examined in my own book, including with pictures. And I think it probably a nice anecdote to illuminate for your listeners and viewers. This Vancouver group, I detailed in my book how a known, that is a target of this international anti-money laundering investigation in Vancouver. So we're talking about how the US government came to the RCMP with information about their highest concern, international fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking and money laundering entity, was running so much of their product, commodity, drug cash through Vancouver that the US government wanted them to look at it. That's the story behind the story of my book. And so this cultural entity, named by the Jamestown Foundation as one of 575 in Canada, my photographic research showed that at one of their Vancouver cultural events was Liberal MP Joe Pescasolido, a number of local politicians, a leader of another one of these extremely high-level United Front Work Department groups in Vancouver, who in fact had extracted PPE from Canada during the pandemic, which was one of my previous reports at Global News. Also at the meeting, as I say, a known alleged Western Hemisphere fentanyl trafficker and money launderer, along with their associate, a former high-level People's Liberation Army official. So what do we have here? At this Vancouver United Front cultural entity, there are a bunch of Chinese tycoons, a high-level pimp and fentanyl trafficker, their associate, a high-level Chinese military figure. We have Chinese consulate officials, Canadian politicians, and everyone together in a room, which this US government sort of adjacent think tank says is part of China's United Front effort to infiltrate our society and ultimately to target the United States and take them down. I'll add one more point. My research is so network-based that I knew several of people that I just talked about at this meeting with Liberal Joe Pescasolido, had also met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in this same time period. In a report also done by the Globe and Mail and myself, Trudeau stumbled into some Canadian surveillance operation. We don't know why he was meeting with these suspected high level gangsters and money launderers and Chinese agents. But I just assert that this is what the United Front is about: compromising our society and our politicians, laundering money, moving drugs, at the end of the day, defeating the free Western world.
Well, there was in one of these articles that I pulled off here today, you wrote about Senator Wu, who was obviously appointed by Justin Trudeau. This is part of our problem with our political system, is if you do get somebody who tends to favor, or one way or the other, we have appointments, we don't have elections of these individuals. But David Vigneault, quote, anyone serving in the House of Commons today is compromised by foreign interference. Now, that's not all knowing, like, not that they've been, actively doing it, but maybe unwillfully. And you mentioned here Mary Ni is
Mary Ing, yeah.
Ing. Yeah, who has not necessarily knowing, but unwillfully maybe, also met with some, high up individuals on the Chinese side. And this is about with an actor who was well known as an intelligence for collecting intelligence for the CCP.
Yeah, that story I think is newly relevant because, the context here is Senator Yuan Paowu very clearly has used his Senate position to make statements that experts on China's United Front can see line up with defending Beijing's foreign policy. So very recently, his latest statement that caused outrage, for a lot of Canadian political watchers is he said that this man, Jimmy Lai, a Christian in Hong Kong who had sort of a little bit of a media empire, and it was all about promoting democracy from Hong Kong. He's been thrown in jail by, Hong Kong's security state, which is the Chinese Communist Party's, front. And Senator Yuan Paowu has the temerity to make another one of his China defending comments and saying Jimmy Lai's activities would get him in trouble in Canada if there was a foreign interference law. And I don't even know where to start with how bad that comment of Yuan Paowu's was, because I think he's a smart person. And I believe he knows very well that the people that really should be in jail in Canada are some of his associates that he rallied with on Parliament Hill in 2023 against a foreign agent registry. Paowu is not a stupid person. He knows the people that should be in jail are the people that he is working with. But why do I say that? I can prove it. My reporting 2 years ago, when I launched the Bureau, obtained a tape recording in which Paowu is meeting online during the pandemic with a number of, I assert, known United Front Group Department members. How can I say that? They're parts of entities that have been named in Chinese government documents as part of the United Front, and in fact credited for being involved in Canadian elections. But here's the real point. Paowu on this tape recording tells these people in a Zoom meeting, I have the pictures, I have the audio. He tells them he is working very hard to use his Senate office to make sure that members of the United Front in Canada are not accused by Canadians of promoting China's state line on Hong Kong. So remember, Hong Kong, Paowu just made a comment sort of targeting Jimmy Lai as a person that should be prosecuted in Canada. And this is why it's okay for China to, have thrown him in jail in Hong Kong. Paowu has made all kinds of comments that line up with his private statements of standing up for the United Front in Canada. And I went to an expert, Dr. Charles Burton, a sinologist, to confirm exactly what he said. And in a nutshell, he said, Yuan Paowu's statements effectively do give free agency to Chinese Communist Party cells in Canada to operate. We could talk on and on about the minutia of that and how it fits into the Jamestown report. But, as I say, I think my tape recorded evidence has proven that, Pao Wu should not be talking about Jimmy Lai being subject to law in Canada. He should be talking about himself being subject to law in Canada. Why isn't he? I just think Yuan Pao Wu, as you say, Justin Trudeau was a bit of a puppet, and that powerful sort of Canada China business lobby connected to Jean Chrétien's business networks, I think probably wanted Pao Wu to be in Senate. That's why he's in Senate, and that's probably why he remains in Senate.
Well, what's interesting about that too, he's playing a role in that foreign interference commission that's coming up, and he's got intervener status. So I guess he's going to be presenting some legal arguments. And on that note too, you did mention that he's not only trying to defend, but he actually promised to shield, was quote in your writing there, United Front members from scrutiny for taking a pro. And it wasn't just Hong Kong, it was Tibet, it was also the Uyghurs, it was also South China Sea. So, this individual in this sort of position of power has a tremendous amount of influence to guide a process one way or the other. And here he is, he's going to be testifying and or presenting legal arguments for this
And
Foreign Interference
actually,
Commission.
just to clarify, that already happened, and he already did gain access to testify, and he did use his position to make those, obviously absurd arguments. But a key thing, I'm glad you pointed out what he said, and people can go to the Bureau and listen to the tape recording. He lists off all the key points that we know are China's top foreign policy. They don't want to be criticized on their genocide against Uyghurs. They don't want to be criticized for throwing Jimmy Lai in jail in Hong Kong. They don't want to be criticized for their increasing aggression in the South China Sea against Taiwan and now Japan. And yes, effectively, Yuan Pao Wu was listing off all those points where I say he's establishing a shield for China's United Front work department, cells, and actors in Canada to go to their, Mandarin language media and make those Chinese Communist Party arguments. So absolutely, Yuan Pao Wu, in my assessment, is using his office as a shield. I think that should be illegal. I really do.
You won't get any argument from me. If nothing else, it's a huge conflict of interest, right? So you would recuse yourself from those types of conversations or discussions. Well, last thing I want to touch on a little bit here is because, as you've probably heard, Alberta is having this little conversation with the rest of Canada about potentially leaving.
Yeah.
Um, and one of the things that keeps coming up are First Nations. And I note here in much of what you've written, there are some really deep connections with the First Nation chiefs in particular. And for me, it's really hard to talk about this topic because, of course, you get attacked on every front. But the reality is, it's not the First Nations people per se, because unfortunately, they're living in horrendous conditions. Many of them don't even have what they need. Money does not flow down. We have, just like we have a health industry, a big pharma industry, military industrial complex industry. We also have an Aboriginal industry where lawyers, consultants, and a handful of people at the top, including, in my opinion, chiefs, who benefit from deals that get brokered. They are certainly individuals, they're human, so they are certainly susceptible to, bribes or payoffs or whatever else. But you mentioned First Nations a number of times in here. Can you just dive a little bit into some of your findings with the connection with, Chinese money and conversations influence with First Nations?
Yeah, I would start by saying I agree with you. There are First Nations jurisdictions that are very well run and with honorable leaders, and there are a number. I think because of jurisdictional gaps, sometimes political reticence on the part of Canadian governments to get involved in criticisms across those sensitive jurisdictional issues or areas that, look, my own reporting based on leaked Canadian intelligence documents has said China is targeting First Nations jurisdictions and chiefs in the north, especially with intelligence operations where they are inviting chiefs that they believe can be fooled or corrupted over to Beijing, on false pretenses. And they're running operations essentially to corrupt them and to gain access to Canadian critical minerals or resources. So this is a major concern in the North. My reporting for the Bureau has, as you recognize, has looked at that issue a number of times over the past few years, and we just had that confirmed in parliamentary hearings, I believe, over the past week. The CSIS Canadian intelligence executives confirmed their top concern, the threat to the north and to the Arctic. The number one threat is China. So you won't have Prime Minister Carney or Foreign Minister Anita Anand saying China's name in the North anymore. We'll hear Mark Carney talking about how Canada and China share a lot of alignment around issues like Greenland. But the reality is China is a huge threat in our North. Of course, this should be of concern to our allies in the United States. And yet we have Carney going in the wrong direction, getting closer to China. Another news outlet called The Rebel broke a story a few years ago about the People's Liberation Army training in our Arctic, which was a totally scandalous sort of breach of security. That's the China issue. Mexican cartels, my reporting has shown, have major access to certain First Nation lands, many in sort of the Ontario, Quebec area along the Great Lakes corridor. There's major cartel smuggling activity going across those lands, which in some cases, this would be about corruption at the senior levels of various First Nations. At other times, it's simply a case where, good First Nations police chiefs just don't have the resources. In many cases, the victimized population on the reserves is being exploited and used by literally 70, 80 gangs operating on the First Nations jurisdictions, even more so than across Canada, where, by the way, we know they're increasingly saturating across Canada, not let alone the First Nations reserves, which are clearly even a bigger vulnerability. So what does that mean? We know illegal cannabis, fentanyl factories, counterfeit cigarette factories, weapons trafficking involving Mexican cartel networks, Chinese Communist Party networks, working a lot with the domestic biker gangs. They're using First Nations lands in a big way in Canada.
Thank you for pointing that out, because the reason I brought that up is, we're talking here, and I use this around Alberta independence, in that the First Nations are trying to carve out, this special treatment. And I believe in Canada in general, and especially if Alberta were to do something, on its own, we have to start with one rule of law that applies to everybody. Nobody's above the law, not a politician, not a judge. If you're found guilty, you need to be held accountable. Every citizen has the same rules that apply to them equally. And with the ruling that I saw come out of Richmond, I found that very concerning, because we have politicians who we know have been influenced. That we have Chinese that are, and I know we have corruption, and we have, illegal activities happening on Native land. Probably more so than others, because it's easier, like you said, either they don't have the resources and or they are corrupt and a part of it. But either way, it just seems like such an easy entry, and an easy way for gaining greater control and influence in Canada. And it is something that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, I agree with you. And whether we're talking about the Alberta potential separatism issue, other regional concerns in Canada, I do believe that wherever you come down on whether you want Canada to survive as a great project, it's been good for over 150 years now, or Alberta chooses to go its own way because they recognize a Mark Carney type Eastern elite government will never fix these problems and recognize the very real concerns in Alberta. I do believe that Canadians that want Canada to survive should agree that, as you say, it needs to be one rule for all. There are very historical, sort of concerns we continue to need to address, but it needs to be done in a way that sort of we've fixed it, it's done, we agree we're on the same page, we're going to be a strong nation, we're not going to let jurisdictions be used by China, Mexico, Middle Eastern crime networks, which is what's happening now. And if you don't have one rule for all, if you have elite politicians making side deals with foreign nations, or selling off property rights to this and that, sort of First Nation that has been able to secure a deal unknown to the rest of the population, yeah, you will not have any national cohesion. I completely agree that that's foundational. It's a moral thing, right? And without that belief that, everyone is on the same sort of level of the law, I think that people will rightly, whether Alberta or otherwise, say, well, maybe they would like to start over at square one and get a better rule of law, for everyone.
Yeah. So I just want to talk because you brought up the Arctic, which has been a big thing, I think, and it's been something that Canada has truly failed miserably to defend, to protect,
Yeah.
even to secure ownership. At one time it was never ever questioned the Arctic belonged to Canada. Now we have lots of different countries who are laying claim, and rightfully so. And I think the United States has a very good reason to be concerned with what's going on in the Arctic. And the fact that Carney is, as you just said, and I totally agree and have said many times, going in the wrong direction. He is driving a wedge between the United States and Canada. He's aligning with China. He's now has an MOU, which the Arctic was discussed. We just don't know what was said.
Yeah, it's a big gap in our knowledge, whether we're talking about the MOU with regards to Canada's federal police cooperating with Chinese police, which should be a non-starter. Chinese media having access to Canada, non-starter. Even things that on the surface should sound good, like Canadians having visa access to China, or what they call greater people-to-people exchanges. With a normal nation, that's good. But with the Chinese Communist Party and its United Front system and its leveraging of criminals, it's not a normal nation. So all those things that Carney has agreed on, even that we know of in vague detail or high level, the headline details, we already know they're non-starters. So you're right. What have they discussed in the Arctic? I have no idea. But when we look at the electric vehicle deals and how I say that will indirectly benefit, again, the Canada-China Business Council type interests that surround liberal prime ministers, especially. I don't think there's anything good when we find what's under those rocks on the Arctic. It won't look good, and it will probably be worrying to the U.S. government. And you're right. I just think it's been very negligent, of Canadian governments for decades now, not to establish, a stronger foothold and industrial sort of base in the Arctic. There's just a lack of forward thinking and national thinking.
Yeah, and it's not even, in past. I look at the actions that this government is taking today, and these are deliberate. Carney knows what he's doing. Carney is not a stupid man. He's well connected. I mean, if he doesn't have an answer, he can certainly find one out very quickly. So these are very deliberate actions that he is, taking against the United States and in favor of China. You're seeing, policies in Canada that are becoming more and more Chinese all the time, as far as, our hate speech laws, restricting media access, like you said, opening up, because apparently we have so many cultural similarities between Canadians and the Chinese. Let's broaden that more. So those are some of the concerns I have. And so much of your work really, I just find there are so many dots to connect here, Sam.
I think my work predicted a lot of the concerns we're seeing now, and it does provide. I'll never say that I always got my sort of forecasting and my mapping right, but I would say successfully identified a lot of the major issues that are really coming home to roost now. And yes, China is in a very sophisticated way using using populations to attack our sovereignty. I really believe that's the issue now. And you're right. Mark Carney only seems to be playing into that. He's not stupid. So, in what way is he benefiting himself, his election chances, and his business friends that want to do more sort of shady business with China? That's my sort of final line in the sand on what's going on in Canada right now.
Yeah, and that's the hard part for me is like they keep talking now about spring election, which is why I think work like yours is so important to get out in front of the people so that they have a better understanding of truly the big issues and, who should we be aligning with? Is it the United States or is it closer ties to China? I think we can all agree that it's probably not closer ties with China. Nortel, I keep telling people, have you heard of this company called Nortel? We talk about Chinese espionage and we're bringing in EVs, and it goes so deep. Last final words that you have for the people who are listening, and of course, I think this is going to go wide and far. So, what sort of things, cautionary things that you kind of gives people something to look at. Obviously, willful blindness was a great way to start. You have the Bureau, which I know you post a number of things. I know you have a podcast. So where can people find you, learn more, and any last words that you might have, Sam?
Yeah, no, it's been really great talking to you. So people should go to the bureau.news. That's my investigative platform, which really launched off the success of my book, which came out at number one in Amazon Canada in 2021. I continue to just do a lot of reporting on the geopolitics of Canada and the United States. And that gets to my message. Sort of, I think there's very severe threats, military and economic, going on in the world that mostly relate to how China and Russia have very deviously and skillfully sort of upended the West's, the best system of them all, freedom and democracy. Western elites that we've talked about have been very complacent over the years. There's been a lot of self-dealing from the Epstein crowd or the Jean Chrétien crowd, the Lord Mandelson crowd, that, these people thought that democracy would always be there and didn't have to be defended, and they could enrich themselves with their friends from Russia and China, while the people in China and Russia were letting them get rich and had a plan, to stick it to the rest of us. And that's where we are right now. So Canadians, for that spring election, if it happens, look, I've been very clear. We need a change of government. The Mark Carney government, I say very clearly, is being anti-American, against the interests of most Canadians. As you say, it should be a no-brainer. Who do you want to be closer to? The United States, even if their rhetoric is a little bit mean right now, or China, it's a no-brainer. But too many people, especially in older generations, have bought the Carney narrative that President Donald Trump and the US are the enemy, not China. That's dead wrong. China's the enemy. And so we need probably 10 to 15% of the sort of older population that got tricked so egregiously in the last election, if they're open-minded to voting for more than one party and they don't want sort of, as I call it, a liberal one-party state. And what that means is a party that has a lot of ties to the CCP. I say, look, if you're an intellectually honest person that wants to think about, what's really at stake in the next election, hey, take a good look at the Bureau.news. You don't have to agree with everything I write, but you're going to find some documented evidence that's going to open your mind a little bit, I hope. That's my last word.
Yeah, for me, it's so many people are emotionally reactive today rather than take a step back, take 3 deep breaths and then dig a little deeper because, so many people dislike Trump, and Trump is a short term problem. If he's a problem for
Yeah.
you, he's a short term problem. If we get into bed with China, and we destroy our relationship with the United States, that's a long term problem, one that, will require a lot of repair, to to kind of even unwind the damage that is currently, I think, Carney is doing. So, Sam, I want to say thank you. I am a big fan. I'm a subscriber to the Bureau. And if you're not, please do check out his work. Follow Sam along. There is great stuff here. And I wish more people would pick up on, some of the threads, Sam, that you've put out here, because I know you're one person and trying to do it all. But, when it comes to finance and geopolitical issues, these are huge. And because they're so complex and there's so many moving parts, people, I think, just get overwhelmed and don't always understand where to look, or don't want to get involved because they are so complex. But these are the two big things that I think people need to understand more of, and I think you do an amazing job at explaining it. So thank you so much for doing that this afternoon, I
Thanks.
guess.
Yeah, it was great talking with you. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So there you have it, everybody. Please do Sam's book, Willful Blindness. You can check him out at the Bureau as well. If you have any questions for Sam, please do put them in the comments, and please do share. Please do like. That certainly helps the channel. Hit the little bell if you want more notifications for more interviews like this. But please do send this around broad, wide. We may have a spring election coming up. People need to know what is going on with our government and foreign interference, and, what sort of geopolitical implications there are in another liberal government. So just, get informed. Take a few moments, just get informed. Send this to a friend, somebody that you think, might have an interest or maybe thinking about going the other way. Maybe this is just enough to bring them back. So God bless you all.